In the final weeks of 1942, the long arc of the Eastern Front from Voronezh to the lower Don was held together by a fragile coalition. After the German summer offensive Case Blue had driven deep toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad, Army Group B was left strung out along the great river bends, its shoulders guarded not by German formations, but by Allied armies from Italy, Hungary, and Romania. The Italian 8th Army, ARMIR, was deployed along the Middle Don, covering roughly 250 to 270 kilometers of front, and forming a key part of the left flank that shielded the German 6th Army at Stalingrad and the communications of Army Group Don to the west. Italy had expanded its original expeditionary corps into the 8th Army in 1942, sending around 235,000 to 270,000 men to Russia in 12 divisions, including Alpine infantry, fast, Celere, and Blackshirt units. Their task on the Don was not to spearhead large offensives, but to hold river positions in cooperation with isolated German corps and neighbouring Hungarian and Romanian formations. The Italian line was thinly manned, with sectors where a single division covered 25 to 30 kilometres, and its defensive system relied on fieldworks, minefields and artillery, more than on armoured reserves. On paper, Armir possessed substantial firepower, about 946 artillery pieces, nearly 400 anti-tank guns, around 280 anti-aircraft guns, more than 1,200 mortars, and over 1,700 machine guns. Its armoured component, however, consisted of only 55 light tanks, 30 armoured cars, and 17 assault guns, mostly models inferior in armour and armament to Soviet T-34s and KV series tanks. Warfare History Network. Motor transport was limited, winter equipment often insufficient, and radio networks patchy, especially in Italian rear units and attached Allied contingents. These constraints shaped how the Italian command imagined a future battle, as an artillery and infantry defence supported by a few mobile groups, rather than a fluid armoured campaign. On the opposite bank, Soviet forces of the southwestern and Voronezh fronts had regrouped after the setbacks of the summer. The relocation of industry east of the Volga and ongoing mobilization allowed the Red Army to rebuild rifle divisions and tank corps and to concentrate formations with increased artillery and armor density. Stavka, the Soviet High Command, which included Stalin, Zhukov and Vasilevsky, had already demonstrated in November with Operation Uranus that it could coordinate large-scale encirclement offensives. Uranus, launched on 19 November 1942, used armies from the southwestern, Don and Stalingrad fronts to encircle roughly 250,000 Axis troops of 6th Army and elements of 4th Panzer Army in Stalingrad. The encirclement immediately changed the strategic meaning of the Middle Don sector. What had been a static front held mainly by Axis allies now became the potential hinge on which the fate of Army Group Don and the Stalingrad pocket would turn. Soviet intelligence and operational research staffs identified the Italian-held stretch as one of the least motorized and least protected against tanks. At the same time, they had to account for German mobile reserves that might intervene from the west and south, as well as for the ongoing Luftwaffe airlift to Stalingrad from airfields like Tatsinskaya and Morozovsk. In late November and early December, Stavka developed an ambitious plan codenamed Saturn. The idea was to strike from the Middle Don toward Rostov-on-the-Don, cutting off Army Group A in the Caucasus and isolating all Axis forces south of the lower Don. This concept assumed that the Stalingrad pocket could be reduced relatively quickly and that Soviet logistics could support deep winter operations across steppe terrain against German panzer formations. In practice, intelligence had underestimated the size of the encircled group at Stalingrad and overestimated the immediate capacity for large-scale exploitation. At the same time, the German command attempted to restore the situation. On November 20th, Army Group Don was created under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein to coordinate the defense between the Lower Chier, the Don, and Stalingrad, and to organize a relief operation for 6th Army. His main effort, Operation Winter Storm, launched on December 12th from the Kotelnikovo area, with 4th Panzer Army and attached units pushed northeast toward the Mishkova River, aiming to open a corridor to the pocket. This left his northern flank and rear covered largely by the Italian 8th Army and German ad hoc groupings along the Don and Chier. Faced with the dual problem of supporting Uranus and countering Winter Storm, Vasilevsky and Vatutin proposed scaling down Saturn to a more limited but still far-reaching operation, Little Saturn, the Middle Don offensive. Instead of driving immediately to Rostov, the southwestern front would concentrate on destroying the Italian 8th Army, Army Detachment Hollet and Romanian formations along the Don, seizing operational centres like Milarovo and threatening the airfields that sustained the Stalingrad airlift. The change reflected not a reduction in ambition, but an adjustment to available forces, transport and weather conditions at the start of the winter campaign. Political and social factors also fed into these decisions. For Berlin and Rome, the presence of Italian, Hungarian and Romanian units on the Eastern Front symbolized alliance solidarity and shared commitment. For their soldiers, many recruited from agricultural regions of the Po Valley, Transdanubia or Moldavia, the steppe war meant long distances from home, unfamiliar climate and dependence on German logistics. For Moscow, the destruction of Axis allied armies promised both military advantages and domestic propaganda value, demonstrating that the coalition supporting Germany could be broken. Civilians in the occupied Don region, living under Axis military administration and requisition regimes, watched the growing Soviet artillery activity and vehicle movements across the river with a mix of expectation and uncertainty. By mid-December 1942, therefore, the Middle Don front was no longer a secondary theatre. It had become a hinge between Manstein's relief attempt and the Stalingrad encirclement, between Army Group B's exposed flank and the Soviet plan for a broader winter offensive. On these frozen lines, where Italian battalions held forward trenches above ice-covered riverbanks, Soviet rifle divisions, tank corps and guards formations were assembling for an operation that aimed to break the Axis front wide enough to influence not only the fate of 8th Army, but the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front. At dawn on the 16th of December, 1942, the Middle Don sector shifted from waiting to action. Along a front where Italian infantry units had spent weeks in routine patrols and cold weather drills, Soviet artillery observers had been quietly registering targets, adjusting firing data on bunkers, wire obstacles, and road junctions. The ice covering the Don and its tributaries, which had gradually thickened through early December, now offered assault troops and light vehicles additional crossing points alongside prefabricated bridges and ferries concealed under camouflage. For several days, Soviet patrols had probed Italian outposts, and the increasing movement of vehicles behind the Soviet lines was noted in some Italian and German reports, but estimates of the scale and timing of a major offensive differed between staffs. The command structure facing this front was complex. On the Axis side, the Italian 8th Army under General Italo Garibaldi held the central portion of the Don line, subordinated to German Army Group B. Its northern sectors were defended mainly by the Ravenna and Caesarea infantry divisions, with German security and support units in depth, while further south stood other Italian formations and elements of the 3rd Romanian Army and German Army Detachment Hollet. Behind them, German panzer and motorized divisions formed a mobile reserve, but many were already committed along the Chier and in the area of Manstein's relief operation towards Stalingrad. Opposite them, the Soviet Southwestern Front under General Nikolai Vatutin had assembled 3 main armies for the opening phase: 1st Guards Army under General Fyodor Kuznetsov, 3rd Guards Army under General Dmitry Lelyushenko, and 6th Army under General Fyodor Kharitonov, supported on the flank by formations of the Voronezh Front and by 5th Tank Army. Vasilevsky, as Stavka representative, moved between headquarters and maintained communication with Moscow, adjusting artillery allocations and tank corps assignments as railway deliveries arrived. Rifle divisions that had been rebuilt in the hinterland now came into line, often with cadres who had fought in previous campaigns, mixed with new conscripts and officers promoted after short training courses. The weather shaped both preparations and expectations. Temperatures on the steppe were well below freezing. Snowdrifts covered trenches and gun pits, and the Don's banks were lined with ice-encrusted reeds. Italian and German commanders believed that such conditions would make large-scale armoured operations more difficult and might limit Soviet mobility, reinforcing their view that the main threat remained south of Stalingrad, where the relief attempt was underway. Soviet planners, by contrast, considered the frozen ground suitable for rapid tank movement, once a gap had been opened, provided fuel and ammunition columns could follow across makeshift crossings. In the Italian forward positions, the opening hours of the offensive began with artillery. After a brief but concentrated barrage on key sectors, Soviet guns shifted from pre-planned targets to observed fire, while heavy mortars and Guards rocket launchers struck assembly areas and command posts. Lines of communication were immediately affected. Field telephone cables were cut, battalion headquarters were forced into reserve dugouts, and some artillery batteries lost observation posts. In many places, Italian frontline companies kept their defensive routines, manning machine gun nests and anti-tank positions, but the disruption of communications meant that higher headquarters received fragmented reports of the scale of the attack. On the Soviet side, rifle regiments advanced behind rolling barrages, moving out from bridgeheads such as those near Verkhny Mamon and from concealed assembly zones in ravines and wooded strips along the river. Assault groups equipped with submachine guns, grenades and satchel charges were tasked with clearing strongpoints, while sappers cut lanes through minefields and marked paths for the following tank units. In some sectors, the attackers met organised resistance and had to fight through successive trench lines. In others, outposts that had already suffered attrition from cold, illness and earlier skirmishes yielded after short engagements or withdrew under pressure towards secondary positions. The first Axis reactions came from local commanders who attempted to stabilise the situation using regimental reserves and anti-tank batteries. Italian accounts describe company and battalion-level counterattacks using available light tanks, self-propelled guns and German support detachments, often coordinated at short notice and with limited radio links. Luftwaffe ground attack aircraft flew sorties against detected Soviet concentrations and claimed tanks destroyed on the approaches to the front, but winter weather and Soviet fighter cover reduced their ability to influence all threatened sectors simultaneously. For Soviet soldiers in the assault waves, the opening phase meant advancing across open, snow-covered ground under artillery fire, with visibility often limited by ground haze and smoke. For Italian infantrymen in the trenches, it meant sudden pressure across wide intervals as Soviet attacks focused on narrow sectors while leaving others temporarily quiet, creating uncertainty about whether they were facing a local assault or the beginning of a much larger operation. In command, dugouts on both sides, officers tried to reconstruct the battlefield from incomplete reports, Vatutin and his staff tracking which axes were making progress and where tank corps could be committed, Garibaldi and German liaison officers trying to identify where to send scarce reserves. By the evening of December 16th, although the full extent of the breakthrough was not yet clear at higher levels, the character of the front had changed. Instead of a continuous Italian-held line along the Middle Don, gaps existed where Soviet rifle divisions had penetrated several kilometers and were preparing to push mechanized formations into the open. The next phase would depend on how quickly these Soviet mobile groups could be introduced and how effectively the Axis command could assemble and direct its armoured reserves, setting the stage for the deeper operations that would follow across the Don steppe. Strategic planning for the Middle Don offensive emerged from overlapping priorities in Moscow. After the encirclement at Stalingrad, Stavka sought not only to eliminate the pocket, but to exploit the weakened Axis flanks. For Vasilevsky and Vatutin, Little Saturn was conceived as an operation with dual purpose: to destroy the Italian Eighth Army and adjacent Romanian and German formations, and to disrupt any coherent basis for Manstein's relief effort by threatening his rear areas, airfields and rail junctions. The chosen axes of advance reflected this logic. Strikes would fall on the sectors held by the Ravenna and Kosaria divisions and neighbouring units, then drive toward key transport nodes, including Kantemirovka, Milarovo, and the lines leading to Kamensk and Rostov. Soviet operational orders defined clear roles for participating armies. First Guards Army would attack in the north, breaking through the Italian line and turning southward. Third Guards Army would hit the central sector, widening the breach. Sixth Army and supporting Tank Corps would push into the depth of Axis positions, aiming for encirclements and the capture of logistic centres. Tank Corps and Mechanized Corps were held in second echelon to be committed only after rifle divisions had opened passages through the main defensive belt. Artillery groupings were established at front and army level, concentrating heavy guns and rocket launchers on selected breakthrough fronts to achieve a high density of fire per kilometre. Logistics underpinned these plans and set their limits. Rail lines from the Voronezh and Saratov regions fed forward supply bases, from which truck columns and horse-drawn transport moved ammunition, fuel and rations toward the river. Ice roads were marked across frozen terrain to supplement limited road networks. Fuel stockpiles for Tank Corps were calculated not only for the initial breakthrough, but for subsequent exploitation phases of tens of kilometres, assuming that captured Axis depots could be used to extend the reach of armoured spearheads. Engineers prepared bridging equipment, sled-mounted pontoons and repair workshops to keep the offensive moving despite winter damage to vehicles. On the Axis side, operational planning in early December revolved around different assumptions. German High Command prioritised Operation Winter Storm and the stabilisation of the Chir and Mishkova fronts. Army Group B and Army Group Don expected Soviet attacks along the Don and Chir, but judged that the primary Soviet aim remained the destruction of the Stalingrad pocket rather than a deep penetration toward Rostov. The Italian Eighth Army received orders to hold its positions, strengthen defences and prepare limited counterattacks if local penetrations occurred, while German mobile reserves would intervene only in case of a larger crisis. The Italian command's planning reflected its resources. Divisions were tasked with maintaining continuous trench systems, building secondary lines and positioning anti-tank guns to cover likely crossing points. Given the thin deployment, Italian staff officers calculated that reserves at corps and army level could only respond to one or two major penetrations at a time. Requests for additional German armoured support and more effective anti-tank weapons had been made earlier, but deliveries were constrained by competing priorities on other sectors. Winter clothing, transport and communications equipment remained unevenly distributed, affecting the ability to manoeuvre and coordinate any large-scale reaction. Intelligence assessments on both sides influenced these plans in different ways. Soviet reconnaissance, using aerial photography, prisoner interrogations and partisan reports from the rear of the Axis lines, concluded that Italian units were less well equipped with armour and anti-tank guns than German formations, and that their morale was under strain after months in exposed positions. These assessments supported the choice of the Italian sector as the main target. However, Soviet planners also assumed that German panzer divisions could be shifted northward if a breakthrough became evident, so they built into their plan rapid exploitation to outrun such redeployments. Axis intelligence, meanwhile, noted increased Soviet traffic, new artillery positions and the build-up of bridging equipment. But reports from forward observers were sometimes interpreted as signs of a limited offensive supporting operations around Stalingrad. rather than an independent major thrust. The dispersion of German air reconnaissance between several threatened sectors and the priority given to supplying Stalingrad by air limited the detailed tracking of Soviet regroupings on the Middle Don. Propaganda and public sentiment formed another layer of the pre-offensive environment. In Italy, the deployment of Armia was presented as evidence of alliance loyalty and a contribution to what official media described as a decisive campaign in the East. Letters and diaries from soldiers at the front recorded a mixture of duty, concern about equipment, and curiosity about the vast steppe landscape. In the Soviet Union, the forthcoming offensive was framed within broader narratives of turning the tide after Moscow and Stalingrad. But for the soldiers and officers of the Southwestern Front, planning sessions focused less on symbolic meaning and more on detailed tables of ammunition expenditure, march times and coordination between infantry, artillery and armour. Thus, on the eve of the main assault, both coalitions had articulated clear objectives, but with markedly different expectations. Soviet plans envisioned a sequence of breakthroughs leading to deep encirclements and the collapse of an entire segment of the Axis front. Axis plans envisaged holding actions on the Don, while decisive developments unfolded farther south. The tension between these planning assumptions would shape how each command interpreted the first reports from the battlefield once the offensive moved beyond the initial artillery preparation and into open manoeuvre. On the 16th of December, once the artillery preparation lifted, the structure of the Italian Eighth Army's front began to break into separate combat islands. In the sectors held by the Ravenna and Kosaria divisions, Soviet rifle regiments forced crossings over ice and snow, attacking company strongpoints with close-range weapons, and supported by direct fire from anti-tank guns brought forward to the river edge. In several places, Italian platoons held their initial positions for hours, but with neighbouring units already falling back or being outflanked. Local resistance no longer translated into a stable, continuous line. Reports from regimental headquarters mentioned trenches overrun, isolated bunkers still fighting, and the loss of contact with adjacent battalions. As the day progressed, the Soviet command began committing its mobile forces. Elements of Tank Corps moved through the gaps opened by the rifle divisions, using pre-marked lanes through minefields and relying on engineers to strengthen crossings. The thin Italian anti-tank screen, based largely on 47mm guns and a smaller number of German-supplied pieces, had difficulty stopping T-34s once they reached firm ground beyond the first trench belt. Some anti-tank positions continued to fire until overrun. Others were bypassed as Soviet tank and motorized infantry columns drove toward village road junctions and artillery positions in the rear. On the Axis side, initial countermeasures relied on divisional and corps reserves. Italian armoured cars and self-propelled guns, together with German assault guns and small Kampfgruppen, launched counterattacks against identified Soviet penetrations. In a few instances, these local actions restored temporary lines along ridges or village edges, allowing retreating infantry to regroup. However, the number of available vehicles was limited, and fuel stocks were not concentrated at the threatened points. The need to respond to multiple breaches along a wide frontage meant that mobile reserves could rarely be massed in strength on a single axis. For soldiers and officers on both sides, the first day's engagements created a rapidly changing tactical picture. Soviet infantrymen who had trained for set-piece assaults now found themselves pushing into improvised follow-up operations, clearing hamlets and capturing depots with incomplete information about enemy dispositions beyond the next ridge. Italian units, many of them drawn from peacetime formations, with strong local identities, saw their familiar regimental structure strained as companies became separated, retreat routes clogged and command posts forced to displace under fire. German liaison officers with ARMIR relayed urgent messages to higher headquarters, emphasizing that the situation involved not only local attacks, but the risk of a full-scale breakthrough. During the night of the 16th to the 17th December, Soviet formations consolidated gains and prepared for deeper movement. Supply columns moved forward along snow-covered tracks, bringing ammunition and fuel to newly established assembly areas. Prisoners of war, including Italian officers and men from support units caught in overrun villages, were gathered and sent to the rear under escort, while Soviet medical teams tried to evacuate wounded across the frozen terrain. On the Axis side, the night was used to attempt the restoration of some form of defensive line along more defensible ground, often without detailed maps or reliable communications. By 17th December, as planned, the offensive began to move beyond the initial defensive belt. Soviet forces advanced toward operational objectives in the depth of the Italian 8th Army's sector and adjacent German-controlled areas. One of the early focal points was Milerovo, a rail and road hub lying to the southwest of the original Don line. Control of Milerovo meant control over lines feeding Army Detachment Hollet and connections toward Kamensk and Rostov. As Soviet units drove into the open steppe, often covering tens of kilometers per day when fuel and weather allowed, Axis rear area command staffs had to decide which depots to evacuate and which to abandon. The capture of Milerovo, reached by Soviet mobile formations in the second half of December, signaled that the battle had moved far beyond a local crisis on the Don. Railway installations, fuel dumps and workshops that had supported German and Italian units were destroyed or taken over. For German planners concerned with the broader southern front, this meant a direct threat to the lines linking Army Group Don with Army Group A in the Caucasus. For the remaining elements of the Italian 8th Army still holding positions or retreating under pressure, it meant that their previous rear areas had become contested space or had already fallen under Soviet control. Civilian populations in villages and small towns along the axes of advance experienced these first engagements as a succession of rapid changes. Many settlements had been under Axis occupation since 1941, with local administration subordinate to German or Allied military authorities. As Soviet troops entered, official structures shifted, requisitioning patterns reversed, and some residents attempted to settle accounts or protect limited resources such as livestock and stored grain. For refugees and displaced persons already present in the area, the renewed fighting added another layer of uncertainty about routes, food and shelter. Morale on both sides evolved under the impact of these opening days. Soviet reports from the Southwestern Front noted growing confidence as breakthroughs were confirmed, and numbers of prisoners and captured equipment increased. At the same time, they pointed to logistical strains and the need to maintain tempo despite frostbite cases and vehicle losses. Italian documents and later testimonies, by contrast, recorded a sense of isolation and fragmentation, with some units still fighting in organized groups and others finding themselves cut off without clear orders. These contrasting experiences at the tactical level would feed into the broader crisis that developed as Little Saturn continued to unfold across the Middle Don and the steppe beyond. By December 18th, the battle along the Middle Don had shifted from localized breakthroughs to a broadening collapse of the Axis front. The gaps torn in the lines of the Ravenna and Kosaria divisions widened as Soviet rifle formations, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns, pressed west and southwest. Attempts by Italian Corps headquarters to coordinate withdrawals to pre-planned positions were hindered by destroyed telephone lines, frozen radio sets, and columns of vehicles and horse-drawn carts congesting snow-covered roads. Units that had been deployed in contiguous trench systems now found themselves retreating in fragmented groups, often without clear information on the positions of neighbouring formations. Soviet armies used this disintegration to push their offensive beyond the tactical zone. 1st Guards, Army in the north and 3rd Guards Army in the centre fed fresh regiments into the expanding breaches, while 6th Army and attached tank corps advanced into the depth, aiming at crossings, road hubs and river lines behind the original Italian front. reconnaissance detachments and cavalry units moved ahead of the main forces to identify undefended villages, abandoned depots, and points where Axis columns were attempting to regroup. When possible, Soviet commanders sought to bypass pockets of resistance, leaving them to following infantry in order to maintain tempo toward operational objectives. Axis Higher Command recognized the danger, but faced competing demands. Army Group Don reported to Berlin that the Italian 8th Army's positions had been penetrated in several places and requested authority to shift mobile reserves northward. At the same time, Manstein's relief group south of Stalingrad was still engaged along the Mishkova River and required every available tank and mechanized formation to sustain pressure toward the encircled 6th Army. Diverting panzer divisions to the Middle Don risked halting Winter Storm. Failing to do so risked exposing the relief forces' flank and the rearward communications of Army Detachment Hollet. On the ground, German formations already present in the sector were drawn into crisis management. Assault gun brigades, elements of panzer divisions, and ad hoc combat groups composed of infantry, engineers, and flak units were dispatched to block key road crossings and delay Soviet tank columns. In some engagements, these groups managed to impose temporary order, establishing fire lines along ridges or around small towns, and buying time for supply depots to be evacuated. Yet the overall correlation of forces was unfavorable. Soviet formations possessed more tanks in the immediate sector, greater artillery concentration, and growing numerical superiority in infantry as Italian units fell back or were cut off. For the Italian 8th Army, the days following the initial breakthrough were marked by a succession of rearguard actions and improvised marches. Divisions that had held static positions for months were now ordered to withdraw along predetermined axes. But the speed of the Soviet advance often overtook these plans. Columns moving westward found crossings already under fire or occupied by Soviet forward detachments. Some regimental groups attempted to break out in new directions, aiming to reach German lines or to form defensive knots around villages. Others, encircled in snow-covered lowlands or forests, continued fighting with dwindling ammunition until overrun or compelled to surrender. The air dimension of the battle added another layer of escalation. Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica units, based at airfields in the Don Bend and further west, were tasked both with ground attack missions against Soviet spearheads and with covering the withdrawal of Axis troops. At the same time, transports remained heavily committed to supplying Stalingrad. As Soviet units pushed toward Milerovo, Kantemirovka and other junctions, they approached or threatened air bases that served the Stalingrad airlift. Commanders had to decide whether to keep aircraft on forward fields, within range of advancing Soviet armor, or to pull them back to safer locations at the cost of longer flight times and reduced sortie rates. Weather and terrain continued to influence events. Sub-zero temperatures and strong winds increased casualties from frostbite and exposure among retreating Axis troops, many of whom lacked adequate winter clothing or had to abandon heavier gear to keep moving. Vehicles broke down on frozen tracks, fuel gelled in tanks and engines, and horses weakened under the strain of continuous marches. Soviet units, although somewhat better adapted to winter conditions and supported by sledges and ski detachments in some formations, also faced significant logistical challenges in keeping fuel, ammunition, and rations moving along lengthening supply lines over damaged roads. Civilian populations in the combat zone experienced the escalation as both liberation and renewed disruption, depending on prior interactions with occupation authorities and local circumstances. In some villages, residents greeted incoming Soviet units and provided guides or information about Axis positions. In others, fear of reprisals, requisitions, or renewed conscription prompted families to hide food or attempt to leave ahead of the front. Administrative structures changed rapidly. Local officials appointed under Axis control fled or were detained, while new Soviet representatives began re-establishing collective farms and local councils, often under the sound of distant artillery. At the political and alliance level, the unfolding situation produced tension and reassessment. German reports emphasized the need to stabilize the line with reliable formations and drew conclusions about the combat endurance of Allied armies under heavy pressure. Italian leaders in Rome received increasingly urgent communications about the difficulties on the Don and the need for reinforcements and improved equipment, which the overall Axis resource situation made difficult to provide. In Moscow, by contrast, Stavka monitored the pace of advance and discussed whether the emerging operational success against the Italian Eighth Army and associated forces could be used to broaden objectives toward the lower Don crossings and ultimately the approaches to Rostov. By 20th December, the Middle Don sector was no longer a front in the traditional sense, but a wide zone of moving battles, encirclements, and retreating columns. The initial defensive framework of the Italian Eighth Army had largely dissolved. Soviet armies were transitioning from breakthrough to exploitation, while Axis commands struggled to construct new defensive lines under pressure. This escalation set the conditions for the peak of the campaign, in which decisions about the commitment or withdrawal of key mobile formations would directly affect both the fate of the Italian Eighth Army and the prospects for any continued relief of Stalingrad. The period from 20 to 24 December marked the operational peak of Little Saturn. As the Italian Eighth Army's structure disintegrated, Soviet command shifted emphasis from breaking lines to destroying groupings and reaching depth objectives. First Guards, Third Guards, and Sixth Armies advanced in echelon, with tank and mechanized corps driving between retreating Axis columns toward key junctions and airfields. Forward detachments of 17th, 18th, and 24th Tank Corps, composed of tanks, motorized infantry, and mobile artillery, operated with considerable autonomy, exploiting gaps and seeking to sever roads and railways leading west and south. Within this moving front, several large encirclements formed. Italian divisions such as Ravenna, Caesarea, and Pasubio, along with attached German and Romanian units, found themselves cut off as Soviet spearheads crossed their planned withdrawal routes. Commanders attempted to organize breakout marches in regimental or battalion groups, often at night, and under constant harassment from Soviet reconnaissance units and artillery. Some of these columns managed to reach new Axis lines after abandoning heavy weapons and vehicles. Others were intercepted and compelled to surrender after exhausting their ammunition. The struggle around Milerovo and the wider Donets Basin illustrated the intensity of this phase. As Soviet formations closed on the town, which functioned as a rail junction, supply base, and rear command center, German staffs tried to orchestrate an orderly evacuation. Trains loaded with equipment and personnel departed under pressure, while demolition teams prepared to destroy warehouses and installations that could not be removed. Despite these efforts, the rapid Soviet approach forced premature detonations and hasty departures. When Soviet units entered Milerovo, they found a partially destroyed but still valuable infrastructure, including rail yards and depots that could be repurposed for their own logistical needs. The advance toward airfields serving the Stalingrad airlift added a crucial dimension. Tatsinskaya and Morozovsk, among other bases, lay within reach of Soviet mobile forces. The 24th Tank Corps, in particular, received orders to drive toward Tatsinskaya, even at the risk of operating temporarily without close infantry support, in order to strike at the transport hub that had become central to supplying 6th Army in Stalingrad. This mission reflected Stavka's assessment that damage to the airlift system would have immediate strategic effects, reducing the daily tonnage reaching the encircled troops and increasing pressure on German command to reconsider its options. For German and Italian soldiers on the ground, the peak of the campaign meant continuous movement and frequent rearguard battles. Ad hoc Kampfgruppen attempted to form blocking positions along rivers, ridges, and village edges, using available panzers, assault guns, and anti-aircraft guns firing in ground roll. In some engagements, these forces inflicted significant losses on advancing Soviet units and delayed their progress for hours or days. However, the cumulative effect of earlier breakthroughs, the loss of prepared defensive works and the arrival of fresh Soviet formations meant that such stands could not restore a continuous front. Soviet troops, for their part, confronted the limits of rapid exploitation under winter conditions. Tank brigades, operating far ahead of their infantry, sometimes entered towns or depots where Axis rearguards, though outnumbered, used buildings and street layouts to mount stiff resistance. Fuel and ammunition consumption exceeded planned rates, making the timely arrival of supply columns critical. Commanders had to decide whether to push spearheads forward at the risk of overextension or to pause and realign with supporting infantry and artillery. Reports from the southwestern front speak of both successful deep raids and instances where mobile groups had to fight their way back toward the main body after operating in isolation. Civilian experiences during these days reflected the intensity and fluidity of the fighting. Railway workers, local officials and villagers around junctions like Milerovo or smaller stations found themselves at the center of contested nodes. Some were ordered by German or Italian authorities to assist in evacuation operations, loading equipment, or preparing trains for departure. When Soviet units arrived, new orders followed quickly, redirecting labor to repair tracks, clear wreckage, or support military movements. Families living along the axes of advance sometimes experienced multiple changes of control within a short period, with front lines passing back and forth at the scale of individual settlements. At the strategic level, information from the peak phase of Little Saturn forced rapid reassessment in both camps. Manstein received reports that Soviet armored formations had reached or threatened Milerovo and were advancing toward Tatsinskaya, implying a serious danger to the rear of forces engaged in Winter Storm and to the broader link between Army Group Don and Army Group A. Axis strength calculations showed that even if additional German divisions were shifted from other sectors, they would arrive piecemeal and under pressure from ongoing Soviet attacks. The resources required to both hold the Middle Don area and continue a large-scale relief operation towards Stalingrad exceeded what was currently available. In Moscow, Stavka evaluated the progress of the offensive through situation reports detailing captured prisoners, guns, vehicles, and territory. The destruction or disorganization of significant parts of the Italian Eighth Army and neighboring formations appeared increasingly likely. Discussions turned to how far the exploitation could be pushed before logistics, weather, and Axis countermeasures imposed a halt. The possibility of further operations toward the lower Don and Rostov was considered in light of these constraints, with planners weighing the benefits of immediate continuation against the need to regroup for later phases of the winter campaign. By the end of this peak period, the geographical reality of the Southern Front had changed. The Italian Eighth Army no longer existed as a coherent operational entity. Instead, its remnants were scattered in isolated pockets and retreating columns. Soviet mobile groups stood in or near former Axis rear areas, and airfields vital to the Stalingrad airlift were under direct threat. The decisions taken in response to this new configuration would form the core of the next phase, when both sides attempted to adapt to a battlefield that no longer matched their initial operational plans. As Little Saturn unfolded, both coalitions moved from initial reaction to systematic adaptation. On the Axis side, the destruction of the Italian front forced German commands to assume direct responsibility for delaying actions. Army Detachment Hollet, reinforced with elements of panzer and infantry divisions taken from quieter sectors, began assembling new defensive groups along river lines, rail embankments, and ridges west of the original Don positions. These formations were instructed to hold long enough to enable the withdrawal of supply columns and staff units from threatened junctions like Kantemirovka and Milerovo, and to cover regrouping Romanian and German divisions farther south. Within the remnants of the Italian Eighth Army, adaptation took the form of improvised march groups. Divisional staffs, when still intact, reorganized scattered companies into combined battalions, often mixing infantry, artillery crews, and service personnel. These groups moved mainly at night, guided by officers with maps or local civilians, aiming to reach designated assembly areas, where German headquarters promised to establish new lines. To conserve fuel, trucks were reserved for heavy weapons and wounded, while many soldiers marched on foot in severe cold. Some Italian units coordinated with German rear guards to pass through temporary defensive screens. Others, unable to find such corridors, shifted their route toward the south or southwest, attempting to bypass Soviet advance guards. Soviet forces also had to adjust. The pace of the breakthrough had extended supply routes, and the initially concentrated artillery groupings now found themselves far behind fast-moving tank units. Front and army staffs reorganized logistic echelons, forming special fuel battalions, increasing the use of captured trucks and rolling stock, and redirecting supply trains toward newly captured junctions. Repair units followed the tank corps closely, recovering damaged vehicles and cannibalizing wrecks for spare parts. Engineers adapted river crossing methods to the conditions they encountered, reinforcing ice with logs and snow or erecting light pontoon bridges where necessary. Resistance on the ground increasingly took the form of localized strongpoints. German Kampfgruppen, composed of infantry, engineers, assault guns and anti-aircraft batteries, occupied key villages and crossroads, turning them into temporary anchor points around which retreating columns could reorganize. In some cases, these positions were held for several days, repelling repeated Soviet assaults and compelling tank units to expend ammunition and fuel. When withdrawal orders arrived, demolitions teams destroyed bridges and depots, leaving obstacles that slowed Soviet pursuit. On the Soviet side, commanders introduced more flexible tactics to deal with these knots of resistance. Rather than commit large forces to frontal attacks against every strongpoint, forward detachments were instructed to bypass them where terrain allowed, encircle them lightly, and leave reduction to following rifle divisions and artillery. This approach aimed to preserve the tempo of the advance toward operational objectives while still gradually eroding Axis combat power. At the same time, Soviet units had to accept a certain degree of dispersion and risk, as bypassed enemy pockets could threaten supply lines or disrupt rear services. Training and previous campaign experience influenced how different units coped with these demands. Some Italian and German formations, accustomed to mobile warfare, adapted more readily to withdrawal under contact, organizing rearguards and using terrain features to delay Soviet pursuit. Others, trained mainly for static trench defense, found the continual movement and fragmented communications more difficult to manage. Among Soviet troops, veteran guards units and tank brigades that had fought in earlier operations often took on the most exposed roles in deep raids, while newer formations filled in behind them to consolidate gains and hold extended front lines. Air forces on both sides adjusted their missions. As Soviet troops approached airfields used for the Stalingrad airlift, German command ordered the relocation of many transport aircraft to more distant bases. Fighter and ground attack units shifted to covering withdrawal corridors, striking Soviet columns that approached major roads or river crossings. Soviet aviation, in turn, concentrated on key axes of advance, supporting tank corps heading toward junctions and airfields and attacking Axis rail traffic. The density of sorties varied with weather, but both sides sought to use available aircraft to compensate for gaps or delays on the ground. Psychological adaptation accompanied these tactical and operational changes. For Axis soldiers, the rapid transition from static defense to retreat under pressure required new routines, discarding non-essential equipment, marching in extended columns, relying on unfamiliar German commanders or staff officers. Letters and later testimonies describe a shift from expectations of holding winter positions to concern about encirclement and the need to reach new lines. Among Soviet troops, the visibility of abandoned equipment, prisoners, and destroyed positions reinforced the perception that the offensive was achieving major results. But reports also noted fatigue, cold injuries, and the strain of continuous operations with limited rest. High command decisions reflected these evolving realities. German headquarters increasingly framed the mission in the sector not as restoring the original line, but as constructing successive delaying positions to protect key routes and maintain a link with Army Group A. Italian command structures, reduced by losses and fragmentation, focused on extracting as many personnel as possible from the collapsing front and integrating survivors into new groupings under German operational control. Stavka and the Southwestern Front staff, observing both the gains and the logistical difficulties, adjusted objectives and timetables, balancing the desire for deep exploitation with the need to prevent overextension. By late December, resistance and adaptation had produced a new pattern of fighting. The Axis forces no longer defended a continuous Don position, but a series of improvised lines and strongpoints designed to slow the Soviet advance. Soviet armies no longer operated purely in a breakthrough mode, but in a combination of pursuit, encirclement, and consolidation. This mutual adjustment set the conditions for the next stage, in which the strategic consequences of these operational choices would become fully apparent for both the Middle Don region and the ongoing struggle around Stalingrad. The turning point of Little Saturn emerged in the last third of December 1942, when operational developments on the Middle Don converged with strategic decisions around Stalingrad. By this stage, the remnants of the Italian Eighth Army were no longer holding a continuous line, but retreating in dispersed columns, while Soviet tank and mechanized corps operated in the Axis rear toward junctions and airfields. What had begun as an operation aimed at breaking the Italian sector now directly affected the viability of Manstein's relief attempt and the wider configuration of the Southern Front. A central event in this shift was the advance of the 24th Tank Corps toward Tatsinskaya, one of the principal airfields supplying the encircled 6th Army. Pushed forward with orders to reach the target even at the cost of temporary isolation, the Corps moved rapidly across snow-covered steppe, bypassing smaller resistance centres and using captured fuel where possible. On 24th December, its leading elements reached the airfield area while transport aircraft were still operating. Tanks entered the perimeter, overran flak positions and destroyed or set on fire a large number of transport planes and ground installations. Crews attempted to take off under fire or to escape along nearby roads, but a significant portion of the aircraft and infrastructure was lost in the fighting and subsequent demolitions. The attack on Tatsinskaya, combined with pressure around Morozovsk and other bases, forced the German command to relocate remaining airlift operations to more distant airfields. This change increased flight times and reduced the number of sorties that could be flown per day. Even before these events, the airlift had been delivering less than the estimated requirement to sustain 6th Army. Afterward, the volume of supplies reaching the pocket decreased further. For the troops in Stalingrad, this meant tighter rationing and reduced stocks of ammunition and fuel. For planners at higher levels, it meant that the option of holding the pocket indefinitely while waiting for a renewed relief effort became less realistic. At the same time, the ground situation confronting Manstein's forces changed decisively. South of Stalingrad, 4th Panzer Army and associated units had pushed to the Mishkova River, coming within several dozen kilometers of the encirclement. However, Soviet Second Guards Army and other formations launched counterattacks that halted and then began to push back the relief spearheads. Reports from the Middle Don and Tatsinskaya showed that Soviet offensives were now threatening the rear of Army Group Don and the junctions connecting it with Army Group A in the Caucasus. To continue Winter Storm in these conditions would have required both additional armoured formations and a secure rear, neither of which was available. Between 23rd and 24th December, Manstein and the German High Command weighed these factors. Orders were issued for 4th Panzer Army to break off the relief attempt and withdraw from the Mishkova line toward Kotelnikovo, while efforts were intensified to organize new defensive positions farther west and south. This decision effectively ended the last large-scale attempt to open a corridor to Stalingrad. Although communications to the pocket continued and some discussions persisted about possible breakout options, the combination of reduced airlift capacity and the cancellation of Winter Storm meant that the encircled forces could no longer expect relief on the scale previously envisaged. On the Middle Don itself, the consequences of earlier breakthroughs crystallized around the same time. Large segments of the Italian 8th Army had been destroyed or dispersed. Groups that managed to reach new defensive zones did so in reduced strength and were integrated under German operational control, while others were captured or remained isolated in the steppe. Romanian and German formations adjacent to the Italian sector, under pressure from Soviet advances, withdrew toward new lines closer to the Donets and the approaches to Rostov. The front that had once run relatively straight along the Don was now bent and drawn back in multiple arcs, exposing the flank of forces still deployed farther south. For the Soviet side, the turning point lay not only in tactical successes, but in the new operational geometry that emerged. With Milarovo contested and Tatsinskaya struck, the southwestern front had undermined the main logistical and operational supports of Axis positions between the Don and the lower Donets. This created options for further advances toward the rail corridors feeding Rostov and for cooperation with other fronts operating against Army Group A. The destruction of a major Allied army and the disruption of the Stalingrad airlift were visible signs that coordinated winter operations could alter the balance along the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front. Participants perceived these developments in different ways. Italian survivors who reached German lines understood that their army, as a field formation, had been largely lost, and that the campaign in Russia had taken a heavy toll in personnel and material. German officers at staff level saw the need to reframe objectives from maintaining extended positions on the Volga and in the Caucasus to establishing shorter, more defensible lines. Soviet commanders and soldiers, reading daily summaries of prisoners taken, equipment captured and territory regained, interpreted the events as evidence that the Axis coalition's outer positions could be dismantled through successive offensives. By the end of December, the cumulative effect of Little Saturn had therefore produced a clear turning point. The Italian 8th Army no longer functioned as an operational shield on the Middle Don. The Luftwaffe's capacity to sustain 6th Army from airfields close to the front had been seriously reduced. The last major relief attempt towards Stalingrad had been called off. Decisions and actions taken in this short period reshaped not only the immediate battlefield, but the strategic prospects for both coalitions in the southern sector, setting the stage for withdrawal, consolidation, and further offensives in the weeks that followed. In the final days of December 1942 and the opening days of January 1943, the active phase of Little Saturn gave way to a mixture of pursuit, withdrawal, and consolidation. Soviet armies that had broken through on the Middle Don continued to advance until they reached lines that could be supplied and held through the winter, while Axis forces concentrated on extracting as many men and units as possible from the collapsing sector. The fighting no longer centered on large-set peace attacks, but on a chain of rearguard actions, crossings under fire, and the surrender or disintegration of isolated groupings in snow-covered terrain. For the Italian 8th Army, this period meant the end of its existence as a coherent field force. Survivors who managed to break out from encirclements moved toward new defensive lines along the Donets and closer to Rostov, usually under the operational control of German headquarters. Many did not reach these positions. Columns were intercepted by Soviet tank and cavalry detachments, cut off at destroyed bridges, or halted by exhaustion and frostbite. Captured soldiers were disarmed, assembled in improvised enclosures, and later marched or transported to rear areas, beginning long periods of captivity that would have lasting demographic and social consequences in Italy. German and Romanian formations adjacent to the Italian sector conducted their own withdrawals. Staff sought to preserve heavy weapons and vehicles, but the speed of the Soviet advance and the damage to rail lines imposed limits. Some divisions crossed to new positions, with substantial portions of their artillery and transport intact. Others arrived with reduced equipment and personnel. Rear services destroyed stores that could not be evacuated, leaving behind burned depots and abandoned material that Soviet troops and local civilians would later sort through. On the Soviet side, front and army commanders issued orders to stabilize newly won lines and reorganize units after weeks of continuous operations. Rifle divisions that had advanced through multiple engagements accepted replacements and absorbed stragglers. Tank and mechanized corps handed over captured localities to infantry and pulled back some formations for refitting, even as other elements continued forward reconnaissance. Engineering units worked to repair bridges, clear mines, and restore railways and roads, converting former Axis infrastructure to Soviet use. Medical services attempted to cope with large numbers of wounded and frostbite cases, including both Soviet soldiers and Axis prisoners. Civilian life in the affected regions entered another difficult phase. As front lines moved westward, villages and towns previously under Axis occupation now had to adjust to renewed Soviet administration. Makeshift field kitchens, hospitals and command posts occupied public buildings. Requisitions and mobilization for labor continued, now in support of Soviet objectives. Families searched for missing relatives who had been evacuated, deported, or mobilized during the occupation, often with incomplete information. The destruction left by the fighting, including damaged housing, livestock losses, and ruined equipment, intensified shortages of food, fuel, and clothing during the winter months. Administrative and legal measures followed quickly behind the troops. Party and state representatives arrived to re-establish local Soviets, collective farms, and security bodies. They conducted investigations into collaboration, partisan activity, and wartime administration under Axis rule. In some areas, returning authorities recognized the survival strategies that villagers had adopted. In others, tensions arose over accusations of cooperation with occupying forces. These processes added a political layer to the material recovery efforts, linking local experiences of the offensive to wider questions about loyalty and responsibility. For the Axis coalition, the immediate aftermath involved reassessing commitments on the Eastern Front. German commanders compiled reports on the fighting, detailing the loss of Italian divisions, the state of Romanian units, and the performance of their own formations in rearguard actions. Italian authorities received lists of missing and confirmed prisoners, as well as requests for replacements that could not be met in full. The losses in officers, specialists, and equipment required reorganization of remaining forces and raised questions in Rome about the scale and nature of future participation in the campaign in the East. Soviet command, analyzing the results, compared planned objectives with actual gains. The destruction of a large portion of the Italian Eighth Army, the capture of prisoners and equipment, and the seizure of operationally significant junctions and airfields were noted as major outcomes. At the same time, reports highlighted the cost in personnel and material, the strain on logistics, and the limits imposed by winter conditions. These assessments fed into planning for subsequent operations along the Donets and toward Rostov, as well as into broader discussions of how to coordinate fronts in future winter and summer campaigns. By early January 1943, a new line had emerged to replace the broken Middle Don positions. Soviet troops held ground far to the west of their pre-offensive start line and occupied key points in the former Axis rear area. German and Romanian forces, with Italian survivors among them, faced the task of defending shorter but still exposed positions while coping with the aftermath of losses sustained during Little Saturn. For soldiers, officers, and civilians across the region, the operation had reshaped daily realities. Front lines had moved, familiar units had disappeared, and the infrastructure that had sustained occupation and resistance alike bore the marks of rapid and violent change. In the longer perspective of the war, Operation Little Saturn became one of the defining episodes in the reshaping of the Eastern Front during the winter of 1942 to 1943. Militarily, it demonstrated that a Soviet front-level offensive, even when scaled down from an original plan, could destroy an entire Allied army and alter the balance of forces across a broad sector. By encircling and breaking up large parts of the Italian Eighth Army and driving deep into the Axis rear, the Soviet Southwestern and Voronezh fronts helped to turn what had been conceived in Berlin as a temporary crisis at Stalingrad into a structural reversal along the southern wing of the front. Casualty figures underline this transformation. Of roughly 130,000 Italians surrounded on the Don, about 20,800 were killed in the fighting. Around 64,000 were taken prisoner, and only about 45,000 managed to withdraw. Romanian and German formations in adjacent sectors also suffered losses in personnel and materiel, both in direct combat and during withdrawals. Soviet forces paid a significant price as well, with tens of thousands of soldiers killed or wounded and considerable tank and vehicle losses across the operations of late 1942 and early 1943, although exact figures for Little Saturn alone are difficult to separate from the wider campaign. Strategically, Little Saturn contributed directly to sealing the fate of the Stalingrad pocket. The advance toward Milerovo and the Donets, and especially the raid on Tatsinskaya and other airfields, reduced the Luftwaffe's ability to supply Sixth Army and exposed the rear of Manstein's relief forces. The decision to halt Winterstorm and withdraw from the Mishkova line was taken in the context of these developments. With the relief effort curtailed and the airlift constrained, Sixth Army's capacity to break out or to be rescued diminished, and the encircled troops were left to resist until their surrender in early February 1943. The operation also influenced the fate of Army Group A in the Caucasus. Although the original Saturn plan to cut off German forces at Rostov was not implemented in full, the advance during Little Saturn and subsequent January operations pushed Soviet lines westward and northward, threatening the communications that linked Army Group Don and Army Group A. This pressure contributed to the German decision to withdraw from deep positions in the Caucasus toward the Kuban and the lower Dnieper, abandoning many of the territorial gains achieved during Case Blue. For Italy, the destruction of Armia had lasting political and social consequences. The loss of tens of thousands of soldiers, including many conscripts from rural regions, weakened the regime's claim that participation in the Eastern Campaign was both sustainable and necessary. News of the disaster spread gradually through survivor accounts, prisoner lists, and private correspondence, affecting public opinion and the attitudes of political and military elites. In the months that followed, these experiences formed part of the background to debates over Italy's continued alliance with Germany and later decisions in 1943 to seek an armistice. Within Germany, Little Saturn reinforced conclusions drawn from earlier operations about the reliability and equipment of Allied armies on exposed sectors. Reports from Army Group Don and Army Group B pointed to the limited anti-tank capabilities, motorization and winter equipment of Allied formations, and to the risks of assigning them to long, vulnerable fronts. At the same time, German officers acknowledged cases of determined resistance by Italian and Romanian units under heavy pressure, while stressing that structural factors such as force ratios, armor density, and logistics had been decisive. In the Soviet Union, the operation entered official memory as one of a sequence of offensives that transformed the Southern Front after Stalingrad. Military studies emphasized the coordination between fronts, the use of tank and mechanized corps for deep exploitation, and the targeting of airfields and junctions as operational centers of gravity. Lessons drawn from Little Saturn influenced later planning for campaigns in 1943 and 1944, including the importance of concentrating artillery, preserving mobile reserves, and integrating rail reconstruction into offensive timetables. Historians have since debated several aspects of Little Saturn. Some analyses stress the role of Soviet operational art in identifying and exploiting the vulnerabilities of the Axis coalition, while others highlight the cumulative effect of earlier decisions, such as the dispersion of German armour, the reliance on Allied armies to hold extended flanks, and the underestimation of Soviet reserves. There is also discussion about whether a different allocation of German mobile forces between Winter Storm and the Middle Don might have altered the outcome, or whether the structural imbalance in manpower, industry and logistics by late 1942 made such variations marginal. For participants and societies involved, the legacy remained personal as well as strategic. Italian veterans and families remembered the Don campaign through memoirs, associations, and commemorations that focused on survival, captivity, and loss. In the regions over which the front had passed, Soviet and later Russian local histories connected Little Saturn with the end of occupation and the beginning of reconstruction, noting both liberation and the destruction left by fighting. In German military literature, the operation appeared as a case study in the risks of extended operations with multinational coalitions under resource constraints. Taken together, these military, political, and social dimensions place Operation Little Saturn at the intersection of operational history and broader wartime experience. It was not an isolated battle, but a link between the encirclement at Stalingrad, the retreat from the Caucasus, and the gradual shift of the war's initiative. By breaking the Middle Don front and removing the Italian Eighth Army as an effective shield, the operation opened a corridor through which subsequent Soviet advances would move toward the Donets, the Mius, and eventually the approaches to Rostov and beyond, helping to define the trajectory of the Eastern Front in 1943.